December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy. But for Japanese Americans, there are a few other infamous days from that era, like February 19th, 1942, the day President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed for the forced removal of all persons deemed a threat to national security from the West Coast to areas inland. And August 10th, 1942, the day the first Japanese Americans walked into the Minidoka incarceration camp. Those 3 days mean a lot to Barbra Berthiaume, and her story is a lot like others. Very similar to the tens of thousands of descendants of the 13,000 Japanese Americans held captive at Minidoka. Except Barbra has shared her story publicly for the past 25 years, stopping by classrooms and community centers, telling the tale of her family and thousands others, those who lost everything and were sent to Dusty's deserts like in southern Idaho. Well, today she was in Kuna, where she grew up. Well, near where she grew up. It was actually Beaumont, Idaho, between Melba and Nampa, where Barbra says there was a beet dump and a grocery store, and that's about it. That wasn't where their family started, though. Barbra's parents were born in Fife, Washington. They were Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, but the first generation born in the United States. And Barbra says the exclusion orders showed up in Seattle in April of 1942. They were given a week's notice and were allowed just 2 suitcases. By May, the Sagami family was figuring out how to live in the Western Washington Fairgrounds in Puyallup.
They called it Camp Harmony. A lot of euphemisms about this period of history. Camp Harmony, pioneer communities, relocation, internment, everything except that it was incarceration in a concentration camp, targeting one group of people whose crime was they looked like the enemy.
The reserved Japanese culture of keeping quiet, Barbra says, kept them from calling it what it was and kept their stories hidden for years.
The shame and the humiliation of being incarcerated because of what you look like has to be absolutely devastating. And how do you recover from that? How do you describe it? What do you say?
Is that why you didn't learn about it until later?
My parents did not say a word.
It wasn't until she was a senior at Kuna High School when Barbra says she first heard about Minidoka.
So I went home and asked my mom. So my poor mom. So I was so angry when I found out that did happen. I just nailed her and I said, how could you let that happen? Why'd you let these people do it? Why didn't you put up a fight? What I didn't realize was they had no education, formal education. They had no economics means, no political clout, minority, perfect victims. I didn't realize at the time. I was just mad.
It was also about that time when Barbra pieced together another part
yes, Uncle Yohe.
Of her family's past.
So, but my mom had a drawer of pictures. And so I'd always go and look at that, and I saw this handsome man. And my mom said it was Uncle Yohe.
Yohe Sagami was one of the thousands of incarcerated Americans to volunteer to fight for his country in 1944. The irony was not lost on Barbra.
The shame of being not fit to serve in 1942, 43, and then all of a sudden you're draftable.
Uncle Yohe was a member of the legendary 442nd Regimental Combat Team.
This was the famous and unique battalion composed of Americans of Japanese ancestry. Volunteers all.
Their motto, go for broke.
This attitude made the 442nd the most decorated unit for its size and time of service in Army history.
Uncle Yohe landed in France in September 1944. A month later, he was killed in the Battle of Bruyere. He was just 22.
I just developed such an affinity, and I thought, wow, you know what? He represents the first Nisei killed in the Battle of Bruyere. He represents a lot, and he represents a lot to our family that shouldn't be forgotten.
Which is why Barbra puts her Uncle Yohe front and center for her presentation.
He wrote a letter to my mom in August of 1944 before he was sent to Europe.
Dearest Michi, hello, sis. And I do mean dearest, no lie.
And it's a typical letter about looking his past, how much he loved his family, things weren't pleasant, how much he misses his mom.
Tell her not to worry about us too much.
And it's a very moving letter, and it just represents so much about why these guys decided to fight and go.
What was that reason?
They wanted to prove they were loyal Americans. They wanted a better life for their children and their grandchildren.
Barbra says the fact her family story, and others like hers, wasn't talked about for so long is why she won't let it be forgotten. Because it's personal for you.
Very personal, yes.
And because in today's culture of hysteria and misinformation, she doesn't want to see it repeated.
If you look at the way the Japanese were targeted and minority groups, they label them. So they have the same labels, they just change targets.
We see that today.
Yes, yes. And so you think of people with no power, no political clout, no economic means, and things could happen to a marginalized group of people.
Any marginalized group of people. We've talked about this before, how Executive Order 9066 was pushed through and based on lies and bigotry. There was never any evidence of criminal activity by any Japanese American that would justify the forced removal. Information the government knew, by the way, before the incarceration began. Barbra's Uncle Yohe was honored in 2016 with a granite monument near the town in France where he was killed, and it still stands today. Barbra was back there visiting, has been there back there a couple of years since. You can see and hear Barbra's story tonight at 7 at the CUNA High School Performing Arts Auditorium.